continue. Co-authored by Bingqin Li and Ilan Katz from UNSW Sydney. And I think most of us are very familiar with the graduate education phenomenon. And in countries or districts like China, South Korea, Singapore, and Chinese Hong Kong, the graduate education is mostly about the fee-paying private tutoring, which aims to improve the uh, examination performances. And the negative effects are very familiar, are very clear. And there's a huge regulation policy for campaign in mainland China. It has been conducted since 2018. The Foreign Ministry and the State Council issued two top regulation policy documents separately. So this campaign's goal is to reduce the study load of primary and secondary school students and the financial burden on their parents. So the government was very serious, and however, at least some parents colluded with tutors to continue private tutoring and compete against each other. So there's a very popular article online titled "Parents in Nanjing Have Been Crazy." So the question is, why did the campaign encounter resistance not only from the education institutions, but also from parents? Because this campaign is trying to help them, help and their children. Um, we also heard some rumors, very latest rumors on the new regulation measures, because I think the central government has heard the parents' complaints, so there should be some new measures. Um, I think the first one is the free or low free school-based after school services would be or will be extended to 1 day of the weekend, at least maybe Saturday, and there could be measure for forbidding child education in school breaks. And I think I heard that a similar measures has been conducted in Beijing. And there's a trend of policy integration between inside and outside school sectors. This is a new direction, and there is a new department of the Ministry of Education has been launched last month. So we have some new measures. So the question is, why these um, the inside and outside school policy integration critical for the graduate education regulation in China? Will the new rumored regulation measures be able to achieve the policy integration to substantially reduce graduate education? That's the question. I think before I introduce the risk question of this paper, I want to have a have discussion on the theoretic background. So to explain why we need inside outside school policy integration to address the child education problem. Uh, the theory is about the perceived competitive accumulation of human capital. I think we are very familiar with the human capital theory, and we are familiar with the credential society theory. So it understandable that parents invest in education competitively and perceive it can help their children to gain a more competitive advantage in the future. So the assumption is less supply in one educational sector would unavoidably result in more supply in the other sectors if there's no function in the latter. So that's the reason why so the inside and outside school education sectors are interlinked. So that's the reason why there should be inside outside school policy integration in theory. Um, so our research question is very simple actually. So to what extent does this integration of quality-oriented education policy itself contribute to the rise of graduate education in China? So let me um, explain the QOE policy a little bit. So this policy is to replace the old examination-oriented education with education for students all around development. So there will be less examination preparation hours in general. But why should we focus on a QE policy? Try to find relation between between QE and the child education. So the first of all is QOE, which is launched in 1993, was the overarching education reform during the growth of the child education in China. And the implementation of QOE and the growth child education were simultaneous. And a few studies include one article published by Li Ilan Katz and Yue this month, uh, uh, suggests that it is this the QOE is associated with child education. So our publication use some fieldwork on the implementation of QOE in schools. And this article, we will use the data of government policy to investigate the association between them. From a policy perspective, it is important to investigate their association, as the current campaign of limiting shared education is employing QE as the guideline. If the association between them is exists, sorry, exists, uh, I think it is not correct to use the current version of QOE to guide the campaign. Um, so yeah, so I will speed up the presentation. So our risk design is clear that we will use the four element policy integration as the analysis framework. So this is developed by Kendall and Besbroke. We have four elements: policy frame, subsystem involvement, policy goals, and policy instruments. We will discuss later. So we will. I have discussed that we will use the data from the government policies, and we will analysis 28 documents, and we will use the thematic coding method to analysis these uh, documents. So this is the documents and the results. So um, the first of all, we will discuss the four elements one by one. Uh, these four elements are the sub-themes of our paper. So first of all, policy frame. Yes, the QOE policy seems very integrated. The QOE reform recognize that it is necessary to develop integrated policy frame in order to move the education reform forward. We find that this is a citation from decision issued by the central government that this reform was performed in across the board reform, and it is a system level project that will affect the whole society. And in terms of subsystem involvement, we find that the decision, the reform, state that all the potential subsystems or the ministries should be involved. Of course, the Ministry of Education should be involved to be responsible for the implementing most policy instruments in the formal educational sector. And also the Communist Youth League, the General Administration of Sport, the Ministry of Culture, and the Ministry of Civil Affairs are responsible for moral education, sports, art education, and the campus activities separately. So all the ministries are involved. About the policy goals, um, the reform require all the potential subsystems to adapt the QOE goal into their own goals, own policies and structures. And we found that the state administration for industry and commerce, which is responsible for regulating child education. This ministry published 5 documents adopting the QOE concern in their policy goals during 1993 to 2018. Of course, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, Statistics, Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, published 26. These four ministries, including Ministry of Education, are the ministries issuing the policy of launching the special campaign in 2018. So before the special campaign, they have already adopted the QOE goal in their own policies and strategies. So it seems at least in terms of the policy goal, the QOE policy is integrated, and the policy instruments, of course, it seems according to the policy goals or policy documents, it is they are consistent. I will skip this slide, so we will check the proposed QOE policy in government documents and find according to the design, it was very integrated. So we can see the reform would kind of change the demand side. The demand is about the educational examination preparation hours. So according to the reform, the demand should be reduced, and the supply also be reduced because there according to the documents, there were some reforms on the school hours, school examination preparation hours, the curriculum and the pedagogy. So the supply will be reduced. So there will be a demand supply balance in the formal education sectors in schools, and so there will be more outside school activities because there are more off campus hours. That's the proposed reform in government documents. However, in reality, we find that the supply side, the school-based examination preparation hours has been reduced according to the government regulation. However, according to the government documents, we find that the demand side is the reform on the demand side is very sensitive and has progressed very slowly. So there is a gap, or there is a hole in the whole educational sector. So that means against the backdrop of the competitive accumulation of human capital, parents need to seek supplementary supply from other sectors, that is from the shared education sectors. So that's the reason why there is a rise of shared education in China. I think according to the theory of Handel and Bistroff, even if the policy goals, frames, goals, and government systems are not integrated systematically, there should still have been chances that some level of integration could be achieved through the integrated setup of policy instruments. So even though there are some inconsistent in the formal educational sector, if there is consistent implementation of QOE policy instruments between the inside and outside educational sectors, there could be some level of integration which could be achieved. However, we found that between the two educational sectors, in terms of the policy instruments, we find that in terms of range of subsystems policy that contain policy instruments, we find the reform only implemented instruments all around development in the formal schools or in the formal educational sectors, but not in the shared education sectors. We find that the teaching content of shared education institutions was not monitored by any authority actually until 2018, which is different from the formal education sector. In terms of the policy instruments, the consistency. So we found that there was a very strict limitation of examination preparation hours in schools only. In contrast, in the shared education sectors, the measures was only to call for and encourage self-regulation by the training institutions themselves. However, in the formal education sectors, we find that there are lots of expectations uh, uh, from different levels of educational authorities and the different government, different levels of governments. So it is very different from between these two educational sectors. And the third, um, about the procedural instruments that procedural instruments at the system level implementing instruments on all around department. This kind of procedural instruments only existed in the school, in the formal educational sector, in the school sector, but not outside. Of course, in the school sector, the Ministry of Education to responsible for all the implementations, the procedural instruments would integrated the basic education, higher education, the department for the textbook, department for examinations. So there's a very good procedural instrument. But for the shadow education sectors, we find that until 2018, there's no real procedural instruments, which result in a very interesting phenomenon that in 1918 in Shanghai, a joint inspection by 4 departments found that approximately 20% of the shared education institutions have neither educational license or business. They should have both, but 20% have none, and 15% only have one, only have the business license but no educational license. So it reflects the procedural instruments are not established well. So the conclusion is the QE policy are uncoordinated, particularly between formal education and the shared education sectors. The lack of consistency and coordination has incentivized shared education in China. And I want to have 1 minute to discuss the implications for the rumored policy measures. I think the policy direction of further integrating the formal and the shared education sectors are correct. However, against the backdrop of the perceived competitive human capital accumulation, the rumored policy instruments are still not able to help achieve the consistency of policy instruments between the two educational sectors because the demand side, the examination, the admission examinations are still very competitive. It has not been changed. In terms of supply side, the new school-based after-school services are not examination oriented and not are voluntary. So I think it is not very attractive enough for parents who want more accumulation of competitive accumulation of human capital. And in terms of the shadow education, they are still allowed to prepare students for educational exams, even if the government shut down the shadow education market completely. I think there will be new black market, or the black market will the existing black market will rise further. So my expectation is that the new measures will reduce shadow education to a little bit, to a little extent, but not substantially. So that's our research, and I will welcome some comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wang. This is a very timely research. Well done, as a very good response to the latest development of the education policy in mainland China. So I would like to see if anyone in the room would like to raise question immediately after the presentation by Dr. Wang. You're very welcome to do so. Any question? Well, if you are not yet ready, then we can move on to the second presenter, and then we can come back to have more questions for the presenters. Okay, is the second paper ready to present? Can I ask?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, very good. Very good. Dr. Zhou, yeah, it's your turn. I give it to you. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
That's excellent. Please carry on.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, thanks for coming to my presentation. I am Zhou Xiaochen from the University of Hong Kong. And today my presentation is about the longer term impact of parental migration on youth educational outcomes. We're going to present the evidence from Thailand. And here is the content of today's presentation. I will first introduce a bit the context of the Thai educational system. And in Thailand, the educational system contains these different stages. The first is the 6 years compulsory primary education, followed by the secondary education, which is divided into two different levels. The first one is the lower secondary education level that cross grade 7 to 9. And the second one is the upper secondary educational level from grade 10 to 12. And the children can choose between two different streams for the upper secondary education. That is, first, the general or academic stream, and second, the vocational or technical educational stream. And after students finish the 12 years, finished grade 12, both students from these two, from the two streams are equally qualified to take the national university entrance examination for college. And here are a bit of the literature review on the current topic. In middle-income countries like Thailand, the internal migration from rural to urban areas and the international migrant to other countries are relatively common livelihood strategies for the household. And the characteristics between the international and internal migrants' household might be different. That the international migrants are usually more likely to send back more remittance to financially support the household, while for the internal migrants, they were more likely to maintain a relatively closer tie to the family. And however, in Thailand, there are actually very limited price studies focused on the parental migration and the children's well-being. And among these limited studies, we had found this mixed evidence. It suggests that on the one hand, the children of the international migrant parents seem to have poor physical and psychological health. But on the other hand, the children of the international migrants seem to have a very relatively high level of resilience. This might be related to the public attitude towards the overseas migrants in Thailand that is generally favorable, which in turn may lead to the positive self-perceptions among the children of the international migrants. And in terms of the relationship between parental migration and the children's education, firstly, parents' migration can provide the financial security for children's education, of course, especially for the international migrants. However, we all know that education is not just a matter of financial investment. The involvement of the parents during the development, the growth of the children is also vital. Also in the Thailand, it has been found that the duration of parental migration, especially mothers, has negatively effect on the children's education enrollment. However, there are still some gaps in terms of the current literature that the difference between the internal and international parental migration has not been fully addressed. And also there are limited studies focused on the trajectory of the education. And therefore, the current study brings a longitudinal approach to examine how different experience of the early childhood parental migration may influence the educational trajectory of the children. And the research objectives include: first, we want to explore the educational trajectory of the young adult in our sample from Thailand. Secondly, we want to identify the patterns of educational trajectories of the children. And thirdly, we want to explore the role of parental migration and caregiver arrangement during the early childhood on the educational trajectory of the children. In response to the research objectives, we have these research steps. First, we will conduct sequence analysis to describe and visualize the educational trajectories of the Thai young adult. Secondly, a typology analysis of the educational trajectory to identify the patterns of the educational paths. And thirdly, we will do a multinomial regression to examine the association between parental migration and caregiver arrangement and the educational trajectory of the children. The data we used are from two longitudinal projects. First is CHAMPSI, which focused on the international parental migration and children's well-being. And secondly is CLAIM, which focused on the internal migration, parental migration and the children's development. The first wave of CHAMPSI was conducted in 2008 with two different age cohort of children sampled. That is the younger cohort aged from 3 to 5 and the older cohort aged from 9 to 11. And for CLAIM, the first wave of it was conducted in 2010. The target sample was children aged between 8 to 15. And for both of the projects, the wave 2 survey was conducted from 2019 and 2012. And as we can see that the CLAIM children sampled when age 11 to 13 in 2010 were actually born in the same years, that is 1999 to 2001, as the comparable older cohort sample from the CHAMPSI. And this combined sample is what we use for the analysis of this piece of work. We ended up to have a sample of young adult of 876 with their age ranging from 20 to 24. And here is the screenshot of, on the right side, hand side, the screenshot of the questionnaires of the CHAMPSI that we collected in wave 2. We collected the educational history of the children from the wave 1 data collection till the academic year of 2019. And in each academic year, we collected the information of the age of the children, their grade, and the type of educational institutes. And the coding of the level of education is at the bottom of this screenshot. And to keep the consistency of the age of the children at each academic year, we use the birth date of the children to recalculate the age of the children at the start of each academic year. And also because we only had this educational history from wave 1 data collection till 2019, we backwards imputed the educational history of the children before 2018 for the CHAMPSI sample and before 2010 for the CLAIM sample. The key independent variable, as I mentioned several times, is the combined parental migration and the caregiver arrangement variable. This variable was generated by two variables, that is the parental migration and the caregiver arrangement. We ended up to have this full category combined parental migration and caregiver arrangement variable. That is first the non-migrant household with parents as a caregiver. Second, the father international migrant and the mother as caregiver. Third, father internal migrant and the mother as caregiver. And thirdly, any type of mother-related migration and the children was taken care by, the child was taken care by a non-mother caregiver. and a series of variables that might be relevant to the educational development of the children. Sorry. Was controlled in the model, including the family wealth, the gender and age of the child, the number of completed year of education of both mother and father, whether there is any family structure change between wave 1 and wave 2, and the number of siblings, number of younger and older siblings of the children. Here are the overall plots of this sample. With sequence analysis, we can visualize the diversity of the educational history of the children. And some of the key characteristics for the educational history is first, the age that the children enter the educational system. The average age was 6.5, and the average length of education in our sample was 13.5, and the minimum length of education was 6, which actually is equivalent to finishing the primary school education. We want to further conduct a cluster analysis on the educational trajectory that I just presented. And here are the model fit indices of the cluster analysis. And ASW here is the most important indicator for us to consider. With it over 0.5 suggests the class structure is reasonably found, and the higher number, the class quality is better. So we could see that actually the cluster 4 to 7 solutions had equally high performance, but due to the analysis that we want to perform further, that is, we want to use the cluster solution as the dependent variable in the models, we ended up to choose the full cluster solution in this analysis. And here is the educational trajectory of each cluster in our sample, that we could see that for the first group, we named it as early childhood group. But actually, the majority of the children have taken certain years of secondary education before they dropping out from the educational system. And the second pattern here is the children who took the vocational track training. And we could also see that there are a few of the children entered college after the vocational training of several years. And the third cluster is the children who took the academic track of education, and after several years of academic senior high school, there are certain children took the diploma education afterwards, and very few of them took this college education afterwards. And the last pattern is the most elite pattern, that this group of children, they went for this primary school, secondary school, academic senior high and college education path. Here are some key characteristics of each pattern that I just showed. Including the gender distribution, the age of children when enter the education system, and the average length of education, as well as whether there is any educational disruption during their educational history. And what I want to highlight here is the gender distribution of the children in different patterns, that we could see that for this academic track, we actually can see a relatively equal gender distribution. But for the early dropout group and the vocational track group, we see more boys than girls in these two patterns, while in the higher school, higher education pattern, the picture is completely opposite, that there are much more girls in this pattern than boys. We further conducted multinomial regression to better understand the different patterns, and we use this early dropout group as the reference group, and we could see that compared to the early dropout group, children with international migrant father and mother as caregiver were more likely to pursue further educational trainings after secondary school, and the children with mother migrants were more likely to leave school earlier. And in terms of the covariance, we see the important role of gender, of family structure change, family wealth. We also see that further educational level is quite vital, but still there is something interesting in terms of the mother's completed year of education, that we see the marginal significance of mother's level of education in terms of whether the children had the chance to be involved in college education. So our study, we tried to explore the educational trajectories of the young adult in Thailand, and we invest whether the parental migration, the caregiver arrangement in the early years is associated with the educational path of the children. We identify these 4 distinguished patterns in terms of the educational trajectory, including first the early dropout group, but still the majority of the children drop out after secondary school. And we see these significant difference patterns in terms of gender distribution among the academic track and the vocational track of education, that in the academic track as well as the higher educational patterns, there are in the higher educational patterns, there are more proportion of girls. And also we see that we see that for the children who entered the vocational track, they actually took quite serious training, that the average year of vocational training in our sample was around 5 years. And in terms of the relationship between parental migration and the caregiver arrangement, we see the negative impact of mother-related migration, and but we did not see the significance on the internal father migrants, which suggests that the parental international migrant may bring more financial security to the children's education. Thirdly, consistent with prior studies, we see the important role as of mother as a caregiver, and it is really hard to find a substitute of the mother's absence in the development of the children. And thirdly, we see these interesting gender differences in our findings, that the girls are more likely to be involved in the higher educational pattern, which actually echoes some of the existing studies in Thailand that suggest that girls are having better educational performance than boys in nowadays. And also we start to see the importance role of the marginal importance role of mother in terms of children's involvement in the higher educational attainment, which might be related to the changing gender power in the Thailand. For instance, it has been found that there has been a decreasing rate of male household head in Thailand, and an increasing trend of female household in it. We acknowledge there are some limitations of the current study. The first is that we did this imputation of the early years of the educational history, and we acknowledge by doing so, we're actually making the assumption that there were no education disruption in the early years of the children. And secondly, because there are really a low rate of mothers migration in the sample, we use this combined mothers related migration categorization in our analysis. And thirdly is that we were not able to capture the changing dynamic of the parental migration and the caregiver arrangement along the development of the children. And in relation to that, we also were not able to collect the changing of the remittance and the quality of relationship with the migrant parents at different educational transition time points, which is something that we may need to overcome in the further analysis. And here is an acknowledgement to the findings of our research. And thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent presentation, a very good research topic. Anyone would like to raise question or comments on this presentation? So if the question would like to be prepared for a little bit longer of time, then we can invite the last presenter to present the last paper of this section first. Is it ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Can
okay,
I go?
Very good, very good. Go ahead.
Okay, just a second. I'll share the screen. Okay. So thank you very much for giving me the floor for presenting these research findings. I also would like to thank the previous presenters for being very gentle and allowing me allocated time. It was very nice. Let me first give one more comment. These slides I also uploaded to the conference folder. So if you didn't, if you missed something, there is also opportunity to check it later on. So let me start with the presentation. I'm going to talk about the very important topic, which is the effect of socio-economic status on academic achievement using data for Japan. And the distinctive feature of this research is the use of machine learning. So far, there was a lot of research that how the socioeconomic status is related to academic performance. And there is ample evidence that there are very large effects. But with very few exceptions, these studies use traditional OLS regressions, which have several limitations. The most serious one, in my opinion, is the assumed linear effects. I will talk about it later. Another limitation is less familiar, but it's also very important. Maybe also important, it's called overfitting, when regression models couldn't generalize to data sets which were not used to were not used for analysis. In other words, if we change the context, the results can be completely different, and so making results not general enough. In contrast, machine learning models are designed to identify any kind of relationship, including nonlinear relationships. They also acknowledge the risk of overfitting because because the final evaluation is done with usually data which were not used for estimation. I will also discuss this feature shortly. The number of studies that use machine learning to examine students' academic performance is increasing in recent years, but still remains small. But by one estimate, there was something like 60 studies who use machine learning, and 80% of them were in the last 6-7 years. However, if you look carefully at this research, most of these papers use very outdated models, such as regression trees, which were developed in 1980s, while more recent developments remain greatly underrepresented. For example, ensemble methods of regression trees that combine different kinds of regression trees, also deep learning and automated machine learning. Let me briefly compare the approach of machine learning with OLS regressions. First, I will just show the conventional specification where we have want to explain y using k explanatory variables, and you can just from this formula you can see that there is parameter beta which shows the constant effect which doesn't change for different values of explanatory variable. And also we assume that the model is known in advance and there is no need to learn anything from the data. We just postulate the model and try to find the coefficients for selected independent explanatory variables. But if the true function form is not linear or it's more complex than specified by our equations, for example, with more complicated interactions, then the OLS method may not work. In machine learning, in contrast, there is no model that is specified in advance. We just provide possible potential explanatory variables, but the final model is learned from the data, and in practice, only some of these explanatory variables will be usually retained, the ones which with the largest predictive ability. Functional forms, functional effects can be nonlinear and with high degree of interactions, and we can just specify the highest level of interactions, for example, up to interactions up to level 4 or level 6, and the machine learning will identify the best model up to this highest level of interaction. It's not usually done in conventional OLS models. To avoid overfitting, in machine learning data are divided into training and testing data set, usually 80-20%. In the training data set, we usually we use training the data set to learn the best model with the smallest prediction error. And for regression, it's usually the root mean square or RMSE. I'm going to use this coefficient shortly. And then once we estimate, find the best model, then comes the testing, the final judgment. And it's done with a data set which is not used for training. Usually about 20% of the data are retained for testing. And again, we evaluate the final prediction error also again by RMSE. Models which are used in this study, first is conventional OLS linear model. From second to fifth, there are machine learning models. ElasticNet is combination of two types of regressions, rich and lossy regressions. The third and starting from the third method, there are ensemble machine learning algorithms, which are basically combine or average large number of regression trees. First one is random forest. Fourth one is gradient boosting machine, in which we, in addition to averaging regression trees, we also overweight the data with the largest residuals. So we pay attention to parts of the data which we fail to explain. It's not done in random forest. And finally, extreme gradient boosting, XGB boost, is the recent modification about, I think, less than 7 years old, which became the algorithm of choice in many machine learning competitions. Data comes from the PISA for Japan 2015. Test scores are for 3 subjects. And then socio-economic status is also combined from 3 variables: education, parental occupation, and home possessions. And PISA uses a number of derived variables. For example, test anxiety or parental support. Basically, students ask different questions about, for example, how supportive parents are. And then we use item response theory, or IRT, to aggregate them into a general index. I've done the same thing, but instead of international weights used by PISA, I use Japan's weights. There are variables that I use. Y is composite index of test scores from 3 subjects, as I said. Explanatory variables are derived from 2 sources. First, the ones that students reported, and then school reported variables. Some of these variables are derived, for example, test anxiety, as I said, or sense to belonging to school, or bullying, enjoy cooperation, are all derived variables. Age, or for example, happiness index is not derived, it's just used as it was collected in the survey. Well, one important thing is to remember is that this is individual students who are reporting the variables about their living environment, about the judgment, how good school or students around them. School reported variables are reported by principals. So for example, if there is a question about student behavior, basically actually it's index of student misbehavior. This is not what students say, but what school principals are saying. Now, this is the first result. This is comparison of performance of the conventional model, OLS, and then 4 machine learning approaches. And you can see that first there are, I will talk about training data. And on training data, about 80% of the sample, OLS gives the highest prediction error, about 72. Whereas ElasticNet is also not much different. But then when we move to ensemble machine learning models, then error is much smaller. And when after we move to the test data set that was not used for training, then you can see that the best model to explain student academic performance was by the last model gradient boosting machine, GBM. Okay, you can see that if you use machine learning, then it takes a lot of time compared with regression, but still, given the current computing power, it's not a big deal. We can wait about 10 or 15 minutes to get much more precise model. This is the result for the best model. This one is gradient boosting machine with the smallest residual, and I look at the variables which turned out to be most important to explain student performance. I will not go into technical details. I just say that this is the ranking of variables, and at the top is the most important variables, whereas at the bottom least important variables. So you can see that the most important variable was index of student misbehavior. And the second was socio-economic status was the second most important variable. And the third most important variable was time spent on studying. On next slide, I look at the results, the same ranking using OLS, linear model. You can see that the linear model produces completely a bit different ranking. Still, socioeconomic status is second most important variable, but school type, or basically it's whether it's private or public school, was most important, but in machine learning, school type was well below the top variables, so there is quite large inconsistency depending which model we use. Now, after showing the differences across variables in in machine learning and OLS models, I will compare the estimated effect from the most important variables, starting from the social economic status, using two models. First one is the best machine learning, GBM, and the second is the linear model, the one that most of the researchers are still using. And for linear model, you can see that there is a linear line So the higher socioeconomic status, the higher test scores, they go up from about less than 500 to almost 600. So there are quite large effect. But if you look at the predictions from the machine learning model, there is no linearity at all. For example, for the lowest socioeconomic status, there is not much effect. Basically, there is a flat profile, then a big jump. Then afterwards there is increased effect, but the slope is much smaller. So if we interested in the most effective policy evaluation, we should focus on this range of socioeconomic status rather than other parts in this other socioeconomic profiles. For the second variable, the index of student misbehavior, we can see now the negative effect. So the more misbehaving students are in school, the lower is the performance in academic testing. But once again, we can see that the effect is not linear at all. And initially, once the school misbehavior is really terrible, then there is not much difference in test scores, that just stays at the bottom. But before that, there is rapid decline shown here. So this kind of pattern is not captured in the linear models used most of the time. And finally, the effect of learning time in school, we can see again that while linear model shows positive effect and machine learning estimates also positive, but up to for students who don't study at all, there is a portion of time that there is no effect at all on test scores. But then positive effect emerges after about 2 years spent in school, and then it goes up. But then if too much studies, actually the effect becomes negative. All this complicated pattern is not captured by linear models. Finally, I'll show the results again for socioeconomic status, but now I compare not machine learning and linear model, but two alternative machine learning models. I will go back to the ranking. So basically, I compare the best machine learning and the second best XGB boost model. And if you look at the estimates of these two models, they're different in how they learn from the data, but you see that basic profile is very much similar. So here we have Rashomon effect from the famous Akutagawa novel, also from the famous Kurosawa movie, where there is truth, but there are different versions of this truth. But once we have good enough models, estimates tend to be very similar because they approximate the same underlying truth and they are equally good in doing that. Now, I would like to move to another machine learning model. This is the automated machine learning approach, which is the latest development in the literature. Serious limitation of machine learning models is need to determine hyperparameters. For some models, the number of hyperparameters is very small. For example, random forest has one major hyperparameter, the number of explanatory variables. So we can easily move between trying one explanatory variable and the maximum number of explanatory variables, and then look across possible options and find the smallest prediction residual. But for the GBM and XGB boost, the second best and the best machine learning, there are much more hyperparameters. There is a complicated grid, and it's very difficult to find the best combination. We can try, but we can never be confident that it's what we find is really good enough. In automated machine learning, the task of selecting parameters is also delegated to machine, to learning algorithm. In practice, we just provide two things. Give data for analysis, say this is our explanatory variables, this is our object of analysis Y, and just specify the time budget for learning, for example, 1 hour. And then machine will start to try different combinations of hyperparameters in representative machine learning models. And then with enough computing power and time, more models are estimated, so the more is better. And this is the result for using automated machine learning. I gave 1 hour time budget. And you can see that with this algorithm, the random RMS prediction error became even smaller, not much, but still better. And actually, the computation stopped at about 40 minutes because there was small additional improvement in the model fit. So there was no need to try searching for better models even more. So, and if we look at the variables which turned out to be important in this automated machine learning model, we see again socioeconomic status as the second best, but class size became number one. And also the index of happiness moved up quite a lot. If you check the results for the best machine learning model before that, happiness was not so important. If you compare the estimates for social economic status between the best previous model without no automation and automatic machine learning model, we'll see again the Rashomon effect, that there is a high consistency similarity between estimated nonlinear patterns. And now I would like to finish with two variables which turned unusual, changed the predictive ranking. The first is class size, now which became the most, which was ranked at the top. And you'll see that in Japan, there are 4 groups of classes, and actually the classes with a smaller number of students had lower test scores compared with classes with a large number of students. The second variable is happiness, and you'll be surprised to see results for this. You'll see the basically linear effect for happiness from the those students who answered 0 to 9. The happier student, the better their test scores. But then there was a sudden decline in happiness almost to the way of the least happy students. So probably there are too much studying here, and which made well, this is I will need to think about possible explanation for this result because I don't have a ready one, but it's very curious. So now let me finish with conclusions. I applied several recent machine learning algorithms to predict and find the major determinants of the academic performance using data set from 2015. And the paper, I think, demonstrated that the best machine learning models greatly outperformed the traditional OLS model in the size of prediction residual. And what is more important is that in ranking the most important variables, socioeconomic status was repeatedly ranked at the top, not always the most important, but usually among the most important top 3 variables. And but across the machine learning models, if we try different algorithms, there was little difference. So we can, I found Rashomon effect indicated that it actually doesn't matter which algorithm we find. Repeatedly, we had very high consistency, indicating that the results are quite robust to the choice of different model, as long as it was machine learning model. As long as it was machine learning model. If you use linear model, the results was completely different. And the best model in terms of predictive ability was the last one, automatic machine learning approach. This is the literature that I mentioned. And let me finish my presentation here.
Okay, thank you very much. An excellent presentation. So we have all 3 paper well presented. We still have about 10 minutes to go, so we can accept some questions raised by the audience within this room. But before that, I can see that there are already 2 questions raised in the chat room from Zhou. So Zhou, would you like to raise your question here directly again to Dr. Zhou, please? Zhou.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful presentation from Xiaochen. And I want to ask the 2 questions. So the first one is because mothers are very important in children's development. So I want to know if there are any implications for that. And the second one is how you categorize the types of parental migration and care arrangement, because I would like to know if there are some children live in the single parent families and how you categorize this type of children.
Oh, thank you, Zihong, for your question. Nice to meet you here. And for the first question, we would like to give some suggestion to both family, schools, and communities, that is including parents, teachers, and school social workers, to pay more attention to children without mother caregiver. And secondly, we hope that this piece of work would raise the concern to both the families when they make the migration decisions, and also the family policymakers when they are trying to support the migrant household, to consider how to trade off between this physical proximity versus the financial gains of migrants for the household. And in terms of the second question, first is, as you may have seen that in the model, we had this family structure change indicator in the model. There are a couple of cases that a couple of the household that become into single parenthood household between wave 1 and wave 2. So if these household were non-migrant household, and if the children were taken care by the parents, they would be categorized into the first group, that is the non-migrant household and parents as caregiver. But if not, that means if they were not taken care of by their parents, they would be categorized into the fourth group, that is for all the non-mother caregiver group. And if it is a migrant household, unless the children are with both parents, that means unless they had either father international migrants, mother as a caregiver, or father internal migrants, mother as caregiver, the case would be included into the fourth group, that is the mother-related migration and non-mother caregiver group. So this group is a combination of anyone who had either mother-related migrants or the children were taken care by other caregiver. I hope this answered your question. Is that clear?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I mean, the organizer would like us, if possible, turn on the cameras because it is recording. So could I invite the presenters to turn on your camera, please? Well, there is another question raised by, I believe, that Ms. Jaiping Yang to the last presenter. Well, I'm sure you can read it from the chat room. Would you like to respond to it, please?
Just give me a second. I will.
Yeah, if you can read the question in the chat room.
Just a moment. Yeah. Okay, I'm reading. Just give me 1 second. Okay, the question about the indigeneity, and there are now several developments which try to introduce causal relationship. And for example, random forest model has recent modification where we introduce the try to solve this indigeneity problem, but they are not yet very well developed because, for example, you couldn't present a ranking of the most important variables. So right now, the current methods that I use are just look at the associations. There is no even pretension to say that this is a casual type of relationship. This is just only association between variables. But I think the movement in the literature is towards more casualty oriented models. We are not there yet, but we are moving in this direction. I hope you answered your question.
Right, okay, very good. So can I ask a question to the first paper, if I'm allowed? I'm going to abuse my power as the chair. So I think that your paper has made a very structural response to the education policy, especially the development of the latest education policy in China. So as we all know that the Chinese government is actively re-engaging the so-called private tutoring markets at the moment, and more regulation will be introduced to tackle the expansion of the private tutoring. So what do you make of it, given your research is this highly related to private tutoring in mainland China? Thank you, Dr. Wang.
Yes, please repeat the last sentence again, because I did some connection issues about online. The last sentence again. Sorry.
Sorry. What do you make of this latest development of the Chinese education policy that is tackling the expansion of private tutoring, which is highly related to the topic of your research? What do you make of it? Yeah.
Sorry?
What do you make of it?
Oh, yeah. So I think also the question is a little bit related to the question from Bingqin in the chat room. I think at this moment, I think the direction of the according to my ideology, my comments is the direction of this city government's regulation policy is correct, because we need to address the academic burden on children and financial burden on families. We try to achieve some degree of educational equity in China, because that's very important for the development of the development of the country and the family. But my concern is that yes, whether these measures will able to achieve the goal, and because we have mentioned that there is a very strong competitive accumulation of human capital, and this parent competition is based on the credential society. These facts, these economic environment around the world. So if we cannot stop the credential society, I think there always been the competitive accumulation of human capital among parents. So our attention, I think also the attention of the central government is try to substantially reduce the shared education market. So try to alleviate, not abolish the academic burden. So in terms of that direction, I think the Beijing's measure to increase the increase the school-based holiday services is appropriate. I think it's correct, But I think because during the break, parents always try to many parents always try to seek some care services from many providers. So if they can meet this kind of care demand, it's great. It will alleviate the financial burden. But I think another demand is about the education. It's about the examination preparation, because the senior high school admission examination is still there. So if they cannot address this kind of demand, this demand, I think the child education is always be a market which will be a need from parents. So I think that's my answer. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent. We just 1 minute beyond the time set to us, so very good. So I think we have a very wonderful discussion on this 3 paper, and if you would like to continue to talk to each other, you can stay in the room, hang on a little bit longer. But if you have interest in other sections, you are very welcome to take part in other sections. We still have other sections that are going to take place in a few minutes. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to every one of you coming to this section. We shall see you again. Thank you very much. So this is the end of this section. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Professor
Bye.
Chan.